The deafening roars of Soviet artillery awoke the 3rd Romanian Army, slumbering inside their frozen trenches in the early morning of November 20th, 1942. The Axis troops were expecting an attack on the right bank of the Don River, but they were totally unprepared for the sheer scale of the massive Soviet counteroffensive. The Romanians fought hard as a brutal battle ensued, but so did the Soviets, who overwhelmed them with their imposing tanks. By midday, Commander Peter Dumitrescu told German Army Group South that it was a matter of time before the front at the Don River collapsed, and when it did, the USSR unleashed its master plan. It was called Operation Uranus, and it called for the encirclement of the Axis forces in the vicinity of Stalingrad. The Soviets were ready to take their territory back. A Rats' War. The autumn of 1942 was the turning point of World War II, in which the uninterrupted territorial gains of the Axis powers across all fronts finally stopped. In Africa, the Anglo-American forces dealt a significant blow to the Italians and General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps at El Alamein, Morocco, and later Algeria. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marines turned to the offensive following the conquest of the island of Guadalcanal and the destruction of the entire Japanese landing force. However, the Soviets still lacked a decisive offensive to reconquer the occupied regions of the motherland. The Wehrmacht and its allies had stormed Stalingrad in August of 1942, swiftly seizing most of the city. The Soviets fought back with all they could, but Joseph Stalin's order to not abandon the city that bore his name led to massive civilian casualties. Despite their valiant defense, the Sixth Army pushed the Red Army beyond the Don River and advanced toward the Volga river banks. Once there, the Soviets reinforced their lines in preparation for a counteroffensive. The Axis expected retaliation before addressing the Soviets scattered on the city's outskirts. On the other side, General Vasily Chuikov and his soldiers engaged the Axis forces in brutal close-quarters combat, employing the city's ruins to their advantage. Crumbling buildings were transformed into fortifications, and the rubble was repurposed as trenches, while minor hand-to-hand skirmishes took place all around the city. Subsequently, the Germans coined the term Rattenkrieg, or Rats' War. Know thy enemy. After suffering a blast injury when a projectile hit his headquarters, General Chuikov decided it was time to launch the counteroffensive ordered by Stalin. Thus, the Red Army began amassing thousands of soldiers, artillery, aircraft, and armor for a new operation. Eventually, over 500,000 troops, 1,400 aircraft, and some 900 tanks would engross the Soviet numbers to face more than 200,000 Germans under the command of Marshal Paulus. The Soviet Stavka, or High Command, included Generals Alexander Vasilevsky and Georgy Zhukov, who prepared a series of attacks to crush the Axis formations at Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and Central Soviet Union. The operations were codenamed Uranus, Saturn, and Mars. The first one launched was Uranus, or Operatsiya Uran, which aimed to conduct a pincer attack on the city's flanks and isolate a critical salient in which Paulus's men were fighting. Stalingrad was located within the salient, and the German Sixth Army was entrenched with the Soviets there. The operation's first stage involved attacking the Axis flanks, which were held by the 3rd Romanian, the 8th Italian, and the 2nd Hungarian armies. Having weakened the enemy's flanks, the Soviets would rally from the rear, encircling the Germans and trapping them inside the city. By then, the Axis forces were already stretched thin in a front over 500 kilometers wide. And while the best units were engaged in the main battle, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian men were to maintain the front line. However, these Axis armies were not only under-equipped, but also lacked the cohesion of the Heer. Knowing the enemy's weaknesses, the Soviets planned to exploit them to the fullest. But during the last days of October, the Germans grew wary of a massive Soviet buildup and summoned more troops of their own. Storming the Don. The Soviet High Command split the attacking forces into 3 army units, namely the Stalingrad Front, the Don Front, and the Southwestern Front. Zhukov and his generals amassed more than 1 million men between the 3. The operation was scheduled for November 9th, but had to be postponed because the aircraft and tanks were not ready. However, the Soviets used the time to perfect the plan, which called for a double envelopment maneuver by attacking both flanks of the enemy formation. Meanwhile, they continued draining the Axis of irreplaceable supplies and manpower, and when the Soviet fighters and tanks were finally ready for battle, the Red Army prepared to attack. At midnight on November 18th, Russian artillery began firing smoke shells to disguise the troop movements on the eastern banks of the Don River, where the mechanized infantry and the armored units were carefully allocated in bridgeheads. At 2 a.m., more than 1 million Soviet soldiers were told they were about to conduct a deep penetration operation against the Axis. However, crucial details were omitted in case they were captured. Besides the cover of the smoke shells, the snow and a thick fog concealed the tens of thousands of Soviet Union soldiers. Additionally, the use of dozens of loudspeakers made it difficult for the Romanian and Italian sentries to hear the roaring engines of the incoming Soviet vehicles. At first, Soviet engineers in white uniforms discreetly approached the Axis lines, cutting wire, clearing mines, and opening pathways for the rest of the Red Army. Then, at 7:20 a.m., a devastating bombardment began across the breakthrough sections. Over 3,500 guns, including the infamous Stalin's organs, or Katyushas, pummeled the Axis lines for no less than 80 minutes. Afterward, both the defenses and morale of the 3rd Romanian Army under Commander Peter Dumitrescu quickly disintegrated. It was now time for the Soviets to strike. Routing the Axis. At 8:50 a.m. on November 19th, the 21st and 65th Soviet armies stormed the enemy lines with the support of the 5th Tank Army. Shortly after, the Soviets destroyed the Romanian trenches and caught the front and rear units under artillery fire. Thousands of Soviet soldiers rushed to the Romanian defenders while shouting the battle cry, "Ura! Ura! Ura!" But despite their ferocity, the few Romanians left were able to hold their own against the first 2 waves. Ironically, the T-34 tanks struggled to find their way to the enemy strongholds through the craters left by their own artillery. Many were blown up by mines and the few anti-tank ordnance the Romanians had at their disposal. Eventually, however, the heroic resistance of the 13th Romanian Infantry Division collapsed as they ran out of ammunition. Those who surrendered were ignored by the thousands of infantry soldiers pouring through their lines alongside the 4th Tank Corps. Soon, the entire 3rd Romanian Army was flanked and routed. Meanwhile, the German 6th Army attempted to send the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions to stop the Soviet armor and rally the retreating Romanians, but it was too late. By the end of the day, over 27,000 Romanians were taken as prisoners. Double envelopment. The breakthrough would continue throughout the night, but in the morning, the Red Air Force strafed the Axis lines with outstanding accuracy, unobstructed by fog. When the Luftwaffe finally responded, it was swiftly overwhelmed by the Soviet aircraft and could only provide little support to the retreating Axis forces. The fleeing Romanians were rendered sitting ducks for S.A. Krasovsky's 17th Air Army, and few made it to safety. Meanwhile, the Stalingrad front launched an attack against the 4th Romanian Army, located on the right portion of the front line. Without proper anti-armor ordnance, the Romanians were soon outnumbered by the Soviet tanks. In turn, the 29th Panzergrenadier Division engaged the Soviet 4th and 13th Mechanized Corps, destroying more than 55 tanks, including upgraded T-34s. Even so, the Germans had to withdraw to reinforce the defenses farther south, while the 4th Tank Corps advanced smoothly through the Axis lines in the north and charged on the German 11th Corps from the rear. As the double envelopment began to take form, the Soviet fronts gradually choked the invaders. The exhausted and overwhelmed Panzer units attempted to break the advance, but were unable to catch up with the superior numbers of the Soviet tanks. By November 21st, the Soviets had penetrated more than 45 kilometers into occupied territory. The last push. The Romanians were decimated in isolated battles, while the Germans were scattered and forced to engage the Soviets under inferior odds. Ultimately, the Soviet tanks got about 40 kilometers closer to General Paulus's headquarters, whom Hitler had promoted to Field Marshal, as no Nazi with that position had ever surrendered. But instead of approving a breakout, Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to establish a defensive perimeter around the Soviet pincer maneuver and press on. Then, the 4th Romanian Army, the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, and a few others managed to fight a way out of the encirclement. By the following day, however, the entirety of the USSR forces crossed the Don River to continue with the second phase of the operation. Soviet tank corps destroyed German units defending the town of Kalach with ease, and at noon, those in the city's surroundings were trapped in the double envelopment envisioned by the Stavka. With no way out, the Axis troops caught between the inner and outer pincer maneuvers were shattered within the next few days. The outer encirclement, extending for over 320 kilometers, would be tightened in the countdown for Operation Saturn. At that point, the Red Army was one step closer to liberating Stalingrad. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest videos. Stay tuned.